Okay, everyone, welcome back to Behind the Curtain, Mysteries of the Past and Present. I'm Ryan. I got Josh here with me as usual, and we have a return guest. This is our first repeat
return guest. Yeah,
Dr. Judd Burton is with us.
Yay.
And it is a pleasure and an honor. We always love hearing from you.
Very much.
So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
We've got in mind today, since Halloween is coming up, kind of a spooky topic. We're going to be doing vampirism, and I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I've heard you talk about vampires and that stuff before on other podcasts, and so it's kind of exciting to finally get to do one for us. This will be our version of it,
our vampire episode. Yeah.
So, but maybe if anybody missed the first time you were on the show, do you mind just giving a quick introduction? What your background is?
Sure. Well, as Derek Gilbert dubbed me years and years ago, I'm your friendly neighborhood PhD. I'm a historian and anthropologist, and most of my work has been in the. I suppose most of my training was Greco Roman classical history, but in general, ancient history, ancient religions, and whether my historical work or my anthropological work, it's been primarily focused on the study of ancient religion. My PhD work I did at Texas Tech. Also did my MA work there as well. That's for 20 years I was your classroom lecturing academic, and then God called me out, to devote my time and energy to the main medium for my teaching now is the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. But in general, I've told people this any number of times that the podcasting world has been the biggest lecture hall that I've ever taught in. Because that's where the audience is, and there have been some really good. I've just found that it's been a very good medium for conveying this material quickly for people to be able to digest it.
Right.
Yeah, currently I'm the senior fellow and director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology.
That's so awesome. And you have a website for that too, right? People can get connected to that and learn more.
People can go there to burtonbeyond.net. Yeah,
awesome.
And check it out.
And you've also done a lot of archaeology work as well out in the field, right?
That's right. Archaeology is technically a subdiscipline of anthropology. I do have a substantial amount of archaeological training and experience on 4 continents, in
That's
fact.
Awesome.
I typically, for the anthropological part of my profession, I typically broadly refer to myself as an anthropologist, which would include archaeology, because I also do linguistics and cultural anthropology or ethnology.
Roger that. So you're a good person to talk to when it comes to the ancient idea of vampires.
The ancient idea of anything, I guess.
Right, yeah. I think what we wanted to do is maybe touch on like the cultural idea of vampires. Like, it seems like our culture has been obsessed with vampires for a good while now. I think ever since the literary works of Bram Stoker and stuff like that. But maybe you can elaborate on that. Like, why are we so obsessed with vampires?
So, whether it's like the Twilight series or the Vampire Diaries, or take your pick. I think the last thing that I watched through was something called the V Wars, which kind of looked at vampires as a pathogen. My goodness, we just had a remake of a few chapters of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Demeter, which I thought was a really
yeah,
interesting picture, and the way that
it was a good movie. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. It not only was it true to the kind of Stoker vibe, but I think that it was really true to what we'll get into tonight, the actual demonic elements that are at the root of the vampire.
Right.
Every now and again you'll get it. And we've also got a remake of the classic F.W. Murnau film Nosferatu coming up here in a couple of months.
Yep.
I think is going to release.
Yep, Robert Eggers. He's a great director, by the way. I'm really excited to see his take on it.
Yeah, he is. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Willem Dafoe is in that. I think he plays the kind of Van Helsing character.
Yeah, he's great. That's going to be fun.
Yeah, he is great. Which is interesting because he also played Max Schreck, the actor who portrayed Nosferatu in a movie about F.W. Murnau, if I'm not mistaken.
Pretty interesting, yeah.
I think I just revealed how much of a horror nerd I am, too.
Same here. I'm totally out of my element on this. I was telling Josh before we started, I can't think of a single horror movie that I've watched.
I was like, bro, what's wrong with you?
I do sci-fi, so it crosses over a little bit, but
yeah.
Sure, but I mean, just on a pop culture level, it's hard to get away from the imagery of it because, I mean, gosh, you can't even walk down the cereal aisle without running into Count Chocula, right?
For real.
So, I mean, it's just saturated. Our popular culture, and it really has ever since the 18th and 19th century, particularly going into the less so the Enlightenment and Romantic eras and moving into the Victorian era. When we start to see things like, the Penny Dreadful novels coming out, and Polidori's The Vampire, and then of course Stoker's novel Dracula. So we've been on this cultural trajectory towards having our culture, saturated with vampires on an entertainment level. Just on that sort of. I don't want to say superficial because it's part of culture. It's ensconced in it.
Yeah.
But treating those topics as entertainment, and then treating the topics as something as part of our supernatural reality are two markedly different things.
Exactly. Yeah.
But again, this is most people's intersection with the topic of the vampire. And that's both a good and a bad thing because there's a lot of baggage that comes along with the pop culture aspect of it, because you're dragging in the capes and the makeup and
all the misconceptions,
theatricality of it all, and the plastic fangs, and I've said this before on a number of occasions, but in order to better understand a vampire, if you're a Christian, you might be asking yourself, why in the world would this even come on my radar as a believer? Isn't this just a bunch of it's just movie stuff, right? It's just at best it's just fable or make believe or what have you. It's important because in order to understand the reality of the vampire, we have to strip away the cinematic and the literary vampire.
Right. Yeah.
Take away the suave Eastern European nobleman, the sexy vampire.
The teenage heartthrob.
The teenage heartthrob vampire that seems to trend so nicely in society today. But the fact of the matter is that as the Bible itself references vampires, it makes reference to these demonic entities. And I would argue as a historian and an anthropologist, because you find these kinds of entities in lore from around the world, in oral tradition and in written tradition, a certain fraction of those have to represent people's experiences in real space and time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't come out of
again, it's
nowhere.
kind of like what Heiser says. It only takes one instance of these things being right
Mm-hmm.
for the paradigm to be completely busted, for the notion of these things being relegated entirely to fable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Josh, we were actually talking about this a minute ago that, well, to your point, I think people do see it as entertainment and they feel safe approaching it that way because a lot of them separated
Mm-hmm.
from that, that spiritual
Yes.
side. But
Yeah.
it really is a
Sure.
real thing that has a real effect. And Josh and I mean, we live
Mm-hmm.
about an hour away from New Orleans, and there's vampire groups, vampire cults in New Orleans.
Yep.
So like
Sure.
it's it's definitely real, and the people that know that it's real and believe it's real, it has to them real power.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
Cultic, yeah.
so I mean, what's kind of the other side of that? Not what we see on the silver screen or in a book. What's really going on behind
Yeah,
that?
where do these Hollywood people get these ideas?
Well, so much of in particular Eastern European folklore is fertile ground for the inspiration for a lot of what Hollywood and filmmaking and TV and whatnot use for making their product, as it were. But again, these traditions speak to they speak to human beings having interaction with these entities. And if you look at it through the biblical lens, the conclusion that I really think you can only come to after really weighing the evidence of world history against a supernatural perspective, in this case specifically a biblical one, is that these entities are demonic, that their origins are pre-flood, that they fit a specific subset of behaviors, both individual and large-scale societal behaviors. If we want to look at a culture of evil, a culture of demons, if you will, and fallen Elohim, essentially. Years and years ago, in fact, when I was an undergraduate, I was introduced to the work of a scholar named Montague Summers. And Summers wrote a series he was this clergyman from Britain, and he wrote a series of books on occult topics like vampires. He wrote one on werewolves. He wrote a couple on witchcraft. Amazing scholar. Pick up any of his books and go to the bibliography, and you'll see just the command of ancient and modern languages that this guy had and the source material that he was able to access. But I read his book, The Vampire, His Kith and Kin, which I recommend to everyone. It stood the test of time. It was written 102 years ago, and it is as close to a complete history and culture study of vampirism as you can get. I mean, there have certainly been great books on vampires, scholarly books on vampires since then, but Summers is still really the benchmark, and I would point people to that. But at any rate, as an impressionable young aspiring historian, I read this book for a medieval history class that I was taking. The paper that I was proposing to write was on medieval vampirism, and so this is where I started, and it just blew me away. In fact, I said that vampires have a pre-flood origin, and it was actually Summers in the prefatory material of this book that really began to connect some dots for me. And it's really just a few sentences in a paragraph where he connects the vampire to the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim in the pre-flood world. In fact, he makes reference to Enoch at this, and it was just, for me, it was paradigm shattering because it made so many things make sense, particularly as I began to look into those relevant apocryphal works, and you get these descriptions of particularly the judgment that's handed down to the Nephilim. When you read it, I think it's First Enoch 15 or there 14 or 15 thereabouts, somewhere around there, where you get the judgment that's handed down to the Nephilim, and there's supposed to be these unclean spirits that continually hamper mankind. They thirst and hunger, but they're never sated. And then when you look in earlier chapters, and even Nephilim and other giant behavior in the Old Testament, they're bloodthirsty, they're cannibals. They when they were worshipped as gods, they demanded blood sacrifice, and so a lot of things start to line up in terms of what the vampire is. So that's why I tell people, take vampire literature and pop culture, for what it's worth. It's entertainment, but it shouldn't dissuade you. Although it does, it should not dissuade somebody from believing in the reality of this, particularly if you subscribe to supernatural reality. I'm sorry, you don't get to cherry pick. It's not a buffet when it comes to what demons are capable of, or really any of these fallen Elohim that we fall on this developing taxonomy of the demonic world that we're starting to learn more about. These entities have had millennia, if not longer, to study, if you will. They're so far to the head of the curve in their ability to deceive that they're able to parade and manifest as essentially anything they want to. So it's not only disingenuous, but it's dangerous, I think, as a believer, to completely peripheralize vampires as something that's strictly cinematic or literary. We're dealing with, again, looking at it anthropologically, we're dealing with a culture of evil. There's an entire culture that demons adhere to, and the manifestation of a vampire is simply one aspect, one element of that. This was something that I did with my book Interview with the Giant, is applying these anthropological models to supernatural culture, whether it was the giants, the demons, the fallen angels, the fallen Elohim. I think when you do that, you're able to tease out some of these attributes of what demons are actually capable of doing. And preternaturalism is part of the weapon, the armaments that they have. Preternaturalism involves both the flesh and the supernatural, so there are elements of both of those things in these manifestations. In fact, I teach a whole program on this through the Institute called Preternatural Morphology that deals with these. It's basically a biblical assessment of things like vampires and werewolves and revenants and ghouls and all kinds of chimera. So really, we're in an interesting time in the history of the world, because it does seem like the veil is sort of thinning, and more people are were having experiences with these sorts of demonic activities, or were just so able to immediately make those experiences accessible by other people, through the internet, through all of the social media platforms, barring hoaxes, of course. But it quantitatively, there does seem to be an uptake in, paranormal experiences that people are having. And that includes, vampire entities.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think the age of humanistic naturalism is coming to an end.
And it's really such an irony, because it's that same humanistic naturalism that gave us the tools to begin to head down, the trail of the empire, and track him down, and account for his reality. The Enlightenment period in the 18th century was this intellectual movement, philosophical movement, to basically peripheralize everything supernatural. Even most of the people who were writing about folklore and the supernatural at the time, people like Thomas Bulfinch is probably the most popular of those guys. Everybody knows Bulfinch from Bulfinch's mythology. He didn't believe in any of that stuff. He was classically educated, so he could talk about it. He found it novelly interesting. But most of there was this strict movement towards strict empiricism, and it's that observation, that movement towards observation, that gave us the tools to record, all of these instances of vampirism and lycanthropy and witchcraft and things of that nature, in the Western world, in Europe in particular, because it's during that period of the, let's say leading into the 18th century, late 1600s going into the 1700s, that we begin to see a profusion of accounts of vampirism, and it's not coming from folklore that had already existed there. Hopefully, I've demonstrated the merit of that in the breadth of podcasts and interviews and things like that I've done. But written records, reports coming from magistrates and lawyers and army officers and army surgeons. These are people that are educated, they're literate, they're able to write. And so it's this twist of irony that this, strict humanism and naturalism birth the perspective, the observational perspective, to put us back on the trail. So it's one of those ironies in history, I think, where the devil made a very visible attempt to try and get all of this stuff out of his way so that he could make his job easier, and it just backfired on him.
That's very, very true. Yeah, I never thought about it that way. And it seems like the church at that time kind of got wrapped up in the whole naturalistic empiricism as well. And
we still deal with the baggage and dross of that today.
Yeah. And that's what kind of tainted, I think, a lot of modern Christians to kind of write off the supernatural, especially in Genesis 6 for sure. Like, almost every commentary will go, a more naturalistic leaning on that. And I think it does such an injustice to what it's actually speaking about.
Absolutely.
It makes me think of when you talked about lycanthropy. I did a English paper one time on Peter Stubb. That story always stuck with me, and it haunted me, man. I was like, wow, what an amazing story, a fantastical story that was. This guy, you probably might know it a little better than I would, but finding or given a magic belt by the devil that would turn him into a wolf, and dude, it's insane. But like you were saying, like people at the time were like saying, yeah, he turned into a wolf and he killed people, and like just crazy.
Well, yeah, and again, the history of the world is replete with shapeshifting of all kinds, whether it's the skinwalkers in the Southwest or were creatures in Europe or in Africa, the were hyena, you're hard pressed to spin the globe and find a place that doesn't have, Germanic traditions are replete with this. The berserkers would actually don wolf and bear pelts,
right?
But they underwent these magical rites to take on the features of these animals. In some accounts even transforming into them. So, and some of those creatures are they're both werewolf and vampire, like the Verkolikos of Greek tradition and related Vkoslak from Slovakia, I think. I think that tradition Slovak. They have attributes of both the werewolf and the vampire, and even in the Bible, right out of Proverbs 31, the Aluka,
right,
which is often mistakenly translated as the horse leech.
Yeah, the leech.
Nothing could be farther from the truth.
We were going to bring that up for sure.
The Aluka was a shape-shifting vampire creature.
That's crazy.
That morpheme and that word LK or LUK, as we would translate it, transliterated into English, is also in the title of the Amalekites, the Amalekim, the descendants of Amalek. That literally means blood lickers or blood drinkers.
Right. And there's lore that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's Jewish writings that would say they were shapeshifters.
Well, yes, there are Jewish writings. I think you're probably thinking of the Targum and some of the later medieval stuff, but long before that.
Right, and that's when why God he told them to not just wipe out the Amalekites, but kill all their livestock.
Well, and that's biblical though, right there. What you're referencing, that's canon.
Right, yeah.
It almost seems like the ancient Hebrews were supposed to be, or by extension, every child of God. That would be the church today. Was supposed to be in a kind of ever war with the blood drinkers specifically, because God tells them they're supposed to be slain down to the last man, woman, and child, as you pointed out, all of their livestock, their animals, anything that they came in contact with. It's probably not accidental that the Amalekites were also the first major obstacle to the Hebrews once they get back into the area of the Promised Land. Here again, I mean, this stuff is hiding in plain sight. It's in the Old Testament. People go look. It's not just the Aluka or the Amalekites, but Lilith. The Lilu or Lilith in Hebrew is referenced on a number of occasions in the Old Testament, in the Psalms, but specifically in Isaiah chapter 34, I believe it is, in a passage that's usually translated as screech owl or night demon, but very clearly in Hebrew it's Lilith. Lilith was a vampire. She ate the flesh and the blood of infants.
And that's something we noticed, that a lot of these stories they go toward. It seems like a lot of the spirits are female, and their target is usually children or pregnant women, and that just seems very intriguing to me. We often get into the realm of conspiracy and stuff like that. And it just seems like there's a lot of conspiracy theories in the modern times of the elite, being fascinated with blood, and the whole abortion topic with killing children and cannibalism, and it all sounds very crazy, but it seems like there's a lot of connection there with these old spirits.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the the practice of the powers that be. Now, I mean, it's not even up for debate now, because it comes out in the news. It's leaked by a whistleblower,
Right.
that these people
Yeah.
are involved in, high thaumaturgic Satanism.
Right.
Whatever form that happens to take, that's essentially what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And in most instances of less so in vampirism, although it's not completely absent, but in cases of shapeshifting, werewolfism, there's a magic at work. You often find witchcraft of some sort involved in the process, and this is both in written culture and in oral traditions. In the case of European werewolves, particularly those in France and Germany, it's not uncommon to find accounts of a salve that included some sort of hallucinogenic compound that was rubbed all over the body as part of the magical rite of transforming
Jeez.
into a werewolf. By the same token, there seems to be a kind of alchemy of the blood that takes place. The ritual consumption of adrenochrome.
Right. That's another
Today
conspiracy
would be
theory
a
that
modern. Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's not even a theory. It's not even up for
it's
debate. It's
real.
been
Yeah.
demonstrated.
Yeah.
And I get it. If people are just beginning to sort of look at this material, it looks crazy. I mean, it looks
Yeah.
insane.
Yeah.
And to classify a lot of these people as vampires or vampiroid, which is what they are. It sounds like a movie, right? I mean, it sounds like, you expect Christopher Lee to come around the corner, but it's reality.
Yeah. Count Dooku.
Well, I was thinking Count Dracula, but that'll work too.
Yeah, but Count Dooku
Yeah.
also, he was a count in Star Wars as well. The didn't Aleister Crowley? I want to say in some of his writings, he said that he was able to metamorphosize into a wolf.
It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, it would not surprise me.
Maybe,
I
maybe
don't
not.
remember coming into contact with that, but
But I know he was into all of that
Crowley.
sorcery.
Well, I mean, he illustrates the point that I'm making here, is that there in the modern era, there are occultists and
Right.
thaumaturgists. Thaumaturgy is just high magic. It's ritual magic. It's something that people are have to be schooled in, essentially. And so it's like the ancient mysteries. You had to be admitted and initiated into it. But it illustrates what I'm talking about here, is that there is often this marriage of ritual magic and becoming one of these entities. Um, that's the gateway, the demonic gateway, for the demon to begin to do its job. And so, lest we get bogged down in the mud, I'm certainly not trying to do that. What I'm trying to do is to illustrate the breadth of occurrence and the breadth of manifestation that vampires can have. In other words, there are core elements, but there's not one mold that the vampire has to fit, because that's not the game that Satan plays.
Right.
That was actually something I wanted to bring up, because first, you mentioned like cannibalism, blood drinking, and ritual magic and all that stuff. So when we talk about vampirism, like how specific are we being? Is that kind of an umbrella term? Because people will have different categories that they shove these things into.
Has to be an umbrella term. Again, there are those core elements. We could talk about the because of the supernatural components of blood, which are explicated in the Bible clearly. In many ways, the vampire is a terrible parody of what Christ offers.
Right.
False eternity. Christ gives his blood. The vampire takes the blood. So yeah, the vampire has to be a very broad taxon. In other words, for all of its manifestations to fit into, but it's a specific one because it has these core characteristics. But the vampire in the Philippines, which is a kind of Lilith creature that can detach its upper half of the body, doesn't manifest the same way that somebody who's gone through an initiation into one of these elite, mystery schools today, that becomes a vampire or vampiroid via ritual magic. Both are demonic, but they clearly have differences. So that's sort of what makes the smaller minutia of the lesser taxonomy a little more difficult. But we are looking at a very broad characterization here of a supernatural reality.
Right. And like you were saying before, like every culture seems to have its own version of the vampire.
Yes, and that's part of the armament, the weapons, the demons use. They're able to both engineer culture for their own uses and adapt to human variations of culture. I touch on this in a paper that I wrote a number of years ago, about three years ago, on the word Rephaim and its relation to the concept and words that we use for king and ruler in Western languages, which is replete. By the same token, you can trace the very word and concept of vampire back to the ancient Proto-Semitic world, and even the historical Semitic world. That word vampire that we have is a fairly recent addition. It stems from older words like the Ukrainian upir and their Slavic variations, upiri, umfir, and even older words like the Turkic obir and ubir, which come from Anatolia, Turkey. And arguably could be tied to older words like the Avi, which was the necromantic ritual pit that the Hurrians used to worship their underworld gods, which is undoubtedly related to the Hebrew Ov for familiar spirit. And most people will be familiar with the story of the Witch of Endor, who used one of these ceremonial necromantic pits. So the word and concept itself, that's another paper that I'm working on right now, can be traced really all the way back to the ancient and prehistoric Near East, ground zero, if you will.
Now, can you elaborate on the pit? Because we've talked about the witch at Indor multiple times, and we're like, whatever she did worked. And, we never knew like what she did, but if you have any kind of insight on that, what do you think happened?
Well, the Abi that the Hurrians used and the Ob, the familiar spirit attached to the the rites that this Canaanite priestess basically is one of these roving Canaanite priestesses. That and the Avi are both morphemically, phonetically, linguistically related to the Absu, which is the Mesopotamian watery underworld where all of their dead ancestor god kings lived. All those concepts are related. When you walk it through the biblical lens, the only conclusion that you can come to is that what they're making reference to are the spirits of these dead giants, the Rephaim in particular, but by extension, the Nephilim. And that paper that I referenced that I wrote, the Rephaim is related to the word Rapa in Ugaritic and Rabbah in Akkadian and Sumerian, which is a direct reference to these underworld gods that lived in the Absu, the abyss. So that's kind of a circuitous route to trace a concept like the vampire, but it's not historically, just in the context of historical linguists and ideation, it makes perfect sense.
Man, what is the fascination and the I've heard Mike Heiser talk a lot about, blood and the significance of blood. Why blood? Like, why is it, and what's the difference between the occultic way of looking at blood and the Christian biblical way of looking at blood? Ryan, you might have some comments on that.
Yeah, I was gonna say if I can squeeze one thing in here, because I like where Josh is going, but you're making this connection between the ritual pits and the Rephaim, and then I'm just trying to help the audience put this together. But you mentioned the Nephilim earlier, the pre-flood Nephilim, so that would kind of be where this whole domino thing started.
It's interesting. A lot of things go back to that. There's so many things that go back to Genesis 6. It's unreal.
What's interesting, I was talking to Josh about this the other day when we were planning this episode, that in Genesis 9, when Noah gets off the boat and offers a sacrifice and the Lord says, I won't destroy the earth again, he says, I'm giving you any animal for food. And it's kind of like up here he says, I'm giving you any animal for food. And down here he says, don't murder, don't spill the blood of another man. Mm-hmm. But kind of the pivot between them was don't consume blood, And it was, and you look in books like Enoch, and like I've been reading through Jubilees as well, and they make a huge deal about consuming blood.
Absolutely.
And every time wickedness starts to spread across the earth, like Noah's descendants, and then the Tower of Babel, and then again after that, one of the specific things it starts mentioning is they start shedding the blood of other men and consuming the blood of animals and stuff. So it's weird that there is this connection. That like, I almost want to say, like, was that something they just thought was gross, so they made up stories about it? Or like, kind of connecting to what Josh is saying, what is the deal? Like, where do we get that idea that, of course the Bible says the life is in the blood, but
yeah, clearly, because they're, and ancient and prehistoric peoples seem to know this by intuition, if not spiritually. It's probably something that's hardwired into our neurotheology. But the sacrality of blood is a perennial feature in human culture. It's clear that there's a supernatural component and a physical component to blood.
Well, you've been listening to Dr. Judd Burton here on Behind the Curtain podcast. We had a little bit of technical difficulties there at the end, but we want to tell Dr. Judd thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about some of these weird topics, that really show themselves during Halloween, like vampires and blood and all these weird things that we deal with in our culture, and that they have a lot of historical roots and significance. And there's things like this in the Bible that the Bible addresses. So that last point that we were ending on about blood is going to be tied into our next episode with Dr. Ron Johnson. He's going to come and we're going to talk about the atonement and the significance of the blood of Jesus, and different ways we can look at that and what did Jesus really accomplish in his sacrifice. So make sure you stay tuned for that, and go check out Dr. Burton's website at drjuddburton.com and also burtonbeyond.net. He has a lot of classes and things that you can subscribe to and learn from, and he is just a treasure. So thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned for the next episode coming up very soon.